Well, no Dan again.
I know.
That's all right. I think
Yeah, it's all right.
we'll have a good discussion. I think he didn't have
Yeah, I think
a
I gotta.
unreasonably contrarian view as he normally does. So
Yeah, I know. Mm-hmm.
a podcast about bourbon and the ones who drink it. This is Bourbon Matters. Welcome to Bourbon Matters. I'm Jake,
And I'm Gold Eagle Jake.
and we are missing Dan tonight again, but we're gonna press on, and we're talking about finished whiskey tonight. I know we've touched on it a few times in the past, but we wanted to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive, and talk about the pluses, the minuses, and some of the other aspects of finishing whiskey. So I think we both have, I think, a strong opinion on this. I think we're pretty aligned, but we might differ in a few places. So I think it'll be a good topic.
Yeah, we made sure that Dan aligned with us before going on and talking about this without him, because as you all know, if there was some argument here, it probably would be a much more interesting episode. But either way, I think there's enough things to talk about, and I'm kind of hearing more and more lately with finished whiskey and people either liking it or not liking it. There's kind of been a lot of chatter that I've heard, at least in just the recent couple of months. Maybe that was partly because we did a finished tasting with the Lake County Whiskey Club. We just did a blind tasting that was all finished whiskeys, and that was really cool. And I think it was kind of not what people expected, because there's a lot of elements when it comes to finishing whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people just assume, like, port finish or cognac finish or something sweet. But there's a lot of French oak that kind of dries out the whiskey. So there's a lot of different variables and a lot that you can do when it comes to finishing whiskey. And I do know a couple people who are like anti-finished whiskey. So it would have been interesting to get one of them on the podcast, but yeah, I don't know, we're just gonna dive into all types of finished whiskey tonight.
Yeah, and like finished whiskey, I think, and you probably have a little bit better perspective on this, but I'm pretty sure Angel's Envy was the first commercially successful finished whiskey on like mass
Actually,
scale. Um,
I'm pretty
Probably
sure it
closely
was.
followed by Maker's 46, or
I
maybe
thought Maker's
Maker's
46
46 was
was number
first.
one. Yeah,
Okay.
at least Makers says that
Yeah.
they were the first.
Mm-hmm.
Angel's Envy is definitely probably the most, or one of the earliest, and especially for like wine finishes to really become a thing. Angel's Envy was definitely first.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, the Maker's 46 is French oak stave finish.
mhm.
Um, and Angel's Envy is port,
Port.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the influence of Angel's Envy, I think, is clear because the amount of like red wine finishes is huge. And then we're seeing some like transitions into stuff like Calvados, and we're going to talk about Armagnac finish. I'm sure tonight because we're both drinking
Mm-hmm.
the new Bacta bourbon that's finished in Armagnac casks.
And yeah, so I just looked it up real quick for the record. Maker's 46 came out in 2010. It was the first commercially released finished whiskey as a permanent SKU. Angel's Envy came out in 2011.
Oh, okay.
So just 1 year after Maker's 46 came out, Angel's
Mhm.
Envy started.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a relatively new
which
thing
is
in the world of bourbon, which is pretty interesting.
yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like you wouldn't think it was only 14 years ago that finishing whiskey started to really become a thing.
Yeah.
Especially because in the Scotch world, a lot of times they're aging fully in these other types of casks. I mean,
Hmm.
they pretty much always are using another type of cask, but
Right.
it's very common to see sherry, port, um, anything, rum, anything outside of virgin oak is much more common in the Scotch world. So it's
Hmm.
kind of surprising that it took this long for American whiskey to jump on that train. And now we see a ton of finished whiskeys. I mean, almost every single brand has some type of finished expression, which kind of leads me to my new point. Like, I think it keeps it kind of interesting.
So, uh, maybe I will be the contrarian
All
here
right.
today.
Good,
So
good. That's we want that here.
I'm a bit of a purist when it comes to finished whiskeys. I don't mind them if they're done well and done correctly. Um, I think the we're kind of seeing, I think, a kind of like desperate attempt in the market to create differentiation through finished whiskeys. Just because we've talked about how oversaturated the market is right now. From like local craft distilleries all the way up to all these new big like super producers coming out like Bardstown and um, Middle West and others. Um, so I think it's really easy for an independent bottler or a sourcer to buy whiskey from one of these mass producers and throw it in a secondary barrel and bottle it and be like, here's something cool. So I that's not to say that they can't do it right, because I think there are several brands that do that extremely well. Um, but yeah, I feel like there's probably a lot more misses than there are hits in the market right now.
Yeah, I feel depending on what brand you're talking about, because obviously there's some brands like Starlight, which almost never misses, and almost everything they do is finished. It's pretty rare to find like a straight whiskey from them. But they're also tasting their barrels that are in these finishing barrels almost every day to really pull it out on the perfect day. Um,
Mm-hmm.
which there's definitely an art to finishing, but there's also possibly a way to hide whiskey that wasn't good enough or maybe not old enough to stand out on its own. And now I'm thinking of like 3 or 4 different tangents that I could run on. So I'm going to have to try and pick one to stick to for now. But brands like Nulu, I think you mentioned how when there's so many brands, there's so much saturation in the market. And I think 5 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we saw a lot of saturated MGP brands pop up because
Yep.
everyone was buying MGP. It turned from being a bad thing to a good thing once people realized how good the juice was.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd rather see a new and up and coming company buy the MGP and do some kind of finish or some kind of spin on it than just throwing it in a bottle and putting it out there with their label on it. Oh, here's another 5 year MGP. Here's another 6 year MGP. So I think brands like Nulu did a really good job, and that's what I'm sipping on right now is our Nulu store pick of double toasted 6 year bourbon. Um, Finished in toasted French oak and also just a toasted standard barrel. But I like what they did because they kind of came into the market as the new guy and said, "Hey, we're not just going to buy MGP and bottle it like everyone else is, but we're going to do all these double oaks and toasted finishes." Kind of right at the perfect time when toasted and double oak was just starting to become a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I do like that. I do like brands kind of putting their mark on it or putting their own spin on it instead of just blending and bottling and putting out more of the same whiskey that we've already been able to find.
Right.
But on the contrary, um, I feel like we are in a state right now where brands are trying to create a lot of scarcity, and maybe they're just creating more and more labels just so they can spread their liquid out, horizontally instead of vertically.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think Nulu and Starlight I think are really good examples of how to do it right, and like that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always gonna hit a home run. Um, but those are two brands that really push the envelope of finishes, and are kind of like those like they're almost like purely experimental brands in some ways. Like some of the stuff that I've seen out of Starlight that you guys have gotten, like blueberry finish and like like pretty like wild, kind of
Mm-hmm.
things that like you wouldn't really. I don't think anybody else probably would experiment with. Is pretty cool, and I think that helps push um the market in interesting directions. And like, I think Nulu does similar things, but I think they're a little safer. They play it a little bit safer.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, yeah, Starlight's like they've got every finish in the book that you can think of.
yeah.
But yeah, finishing whiskey I think is definitely an art because it can go one or two ways. You can put something in a barrel, and as we know, every single barrel of bourbon tastes different. Even if it was distilled on the same day with the same recipe and it sat next to each other its whole life, it's going to taste different when it's done aging. So if you take
Mhm.
X barrel and you put it into a blueberry port barrel, and you take Y barrel and you put it into a blueberry port barrel, they can taste completely different after 2 or 3 months because they're different whiskeys when they went in there, even though they were sister barrels. And same thing,
Mhm.
especially when you're doing that many finishes. Um, you really, really need to pay attention to how these barrels are maturing in the finishing barrel. And I know we're going to probably use Starlight a lot as an example with this, but the reason is because they do actually taste all their finishing barrels like every couple of days. So they are very closely monitoring everything that's in a secondary barrel and pulling it out at peak maturity. And one example that I have is when we did the Jepson's Orange Curacao barrel back a couple of years ago. That was a really
Mhm.
cool learning experiment because they brought us a sample of the whiskey in the Orange Curacao barrel. Well, first off, we got to pick a barrel to go in there. So we kind of went for something that was a little bit orangey off the bat. But then
Mhm.
they brought us a sample every week. So we got to see how it changed as it sat in that orange curacao barrel. And it was almost like no change, no change, no change for the first 2 or 3 months. And then all of a sudden, boom, like we got a syrup bomb out of nowhere.
Mhm.
And then it drastically started changing, and that was kind of our first experiment doing something like this, especially in orange curacao. So it was very hard to tell. There's still some people who were part of that pick that said we should have left it in there longer. But it's one of those things where one time you try it, it can completely turn for the worse, and you went too far,
Yeah.
and there's no way to undo it. Um, so yeah, there's an art to finishing, just like there's an art to blending. You're not just throwing whiskey in a barrel
Mhm.
and waiting 3 months and pulling it out. Just like you're not just blending, you're not just mixing, 3 or 4 barrels together and hoping the blend works out. Like there's an art to creating that final product.
Right. And then like time is definitely incredibly important. Like the big trend right now that's, well, now it's sort of dying off, I think, because it is so difficult to do correctly, is the Amberana finish. And I think some brands out the gate let it sit too long, and it really oversaturated the palate with the Amberana like baking spice notes and the cinnamon and that kind of stuff, and it just blows the whiskey out. And
See, I
like
think
from what
Amberana's
we've talked
dying.
to,
Sorry, go ahead.
like what we've talked about, I think you've talked to actual like distillers about this, is that like they're leaving an Amberana in for weeks, not months,
Yeah,
because it's so potent. And like that's something that really I think you're only going to find out through experimentation. And once brands figure that out and dial it in, it can be really good. Like I think the best one that I've tried is the barrel Amberana finish. They balanced it so well with the actual flavors of the bourbon.
yeah. The
Um,
barrel is very balanced. Like you can almost not tell there's Amberana in there, which is very rare for Amberana. Like usually it screams at you when it's in the glass.
right.
But yeah, I think Amberana is kind of dying because how much Amberana can you really drink? The people who like Amberana and the people that love Amberana will tell you it's a one pour a night. It's the end of the night. I want something a little sweet,
Mhm.
a little different. It's not something that you're just sitting there drinking pour after pour after pour. And there's the other half of the room that doesn't like Amberana at all. So all of a sudden, Amberana became popular. Every distillery is like, "Oh, we got to jump on this and do an Amberana finish." And then all of a sudden, it's like the people who like Amberana don't want to buy more Amberana because they're not drinking it fast enough. Um,
Mhm.
but speaking on that Amberana, buy the Hard Truth Amberana as soon as that comes out. Because
Yeah.
no, I got to taste a sneak peek of that, and that is a good representation of Amberana. They blended like their chocolate malt with their wheated bourbon, I think, and there's only a little kiss of Amberana. It's chocolatey, desserty, but definitely not over the top. So that's one that I think is going to be kind of maybe bringing Amberana back a little bit, but I still think it's
Mhm.
definitely on the downturn just because there's so much Amberana out there now, and consumers just don't need more of it.
Yeah. And that's going to kind of lead me into my other hot take of the episode. I don't think that. Well, let me rephrase. I think bourbon should be incredibly sparingly finished. I think bourbon is pretty sweet to begin with, and most of the time it just needs to be left alone. I think if you're dying to finish something, you should finish something. You should finish rye, because I think rye has all the complementary notes to a sweet wine or wood type or whatever the case is, or rum. And it just balances way better, in my opinion, than bourbon does with a lot of those sweet things. I know a lot of people are like gravitate towards super sweet, pours of bourbon, and like that's fine. You do you, but I'm personally a big fan of finished rye because I think the flavor profile perfectly matches with things like rum or amberana or honey or name your sweet liquid that was in a barrel first.
There's also a lot more complexity and differentiation between ryes, so there's a
Yeah.
lot more flavor to explore there when it comes to finishing. I'm not going to go out there and say nobody should finish bourbon, because I do think it really keeps it
I'm
interesting.
pretty close.
I'm not there. I do think it keeps it interesting, but I think we're kind of getting to a point now where there's almost, and I'd have to do a real count and fact check this, but I think there's almost more finished bourbon on the shelf than there is unfinished.
Yeah, I could see that.
Just because every brand is starting to come out with something finished, um, and how many different SKUs of unfinished whiskey can you have? Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think every brand should have something finished, but I don't know. I'm going to use Old Elk as an example because they're just right behind you on your shelf.
Yeah.
They have their wheat whiskey, their wheated bourbon, and their straight bourbon, and then they probably have like 20 other expressions that are all different random finishes. But in their defense, I think they're doing it right because they're not like permanent releases. They're more so like
Yeah.
just one-off limited things. And I like that because if big fan of a distillery, I want to explore what they have to offer. Their, what can their whiskey really do? What range of flavors can it really hit? And
Hmm.
I think doing one-off finishes like that is a really cool idea. But I don't know. For a brand to have like permanent SKUs and multiple permanent SKUs of a finished whiskey, um, I just think if it's not a home run, people are going to get tired of it at some point.
Yeah. And thinking about that a little bit more, I think I'm only in my head counting two, maybe three of the big six distilleries actually offer some kind of finished SKU. Obviously, Maker's 46 is probably the biggest. Heaven Hill, I believe, only has Elijah Craig toasted. And then Wild Turkey has some of the Masters Keep releases that are finished and things, but like I don't even necessarily want to count that
Yeah,
because those are just
I don't know if you'd want to count
unicorn
that, right?
one-offs. But like
Imagine if,
Buffalo Trace
yeah,
doesn't have
I
finishes,
was,
Four Roses doesn't have
it's a
finishes.
good transition
Like,
because what if Buffalo Trace came out with like a Armagnac finished stag or something? And
I think
will they
people would be
ever?
pissed because they're like, why can't you give me normal
Well,
stag?
you know they're gonna.
But you're
You know they're
finishing
going
shit.
to, because that's their model.
Well, yeah, I think,
As soon as they get enough whiskey, they're gonna create a new label so that
yeah,
their stuff can't be accessible and can't be on the shelf. As soon as fast forward 2-3 years when Taylor is everywhere, we're gonna see a port finish Taylor come out and I mean they are doing a lot of experimental stuff. They have a lot of barrels that are just pure experimentation. Um,
mm-hmm.
and a lot of that too is not just finished whiskey. A lot of that is like weird mash bills and weird grains that they're using to distill. But I would love to see them come out with a couple different finished things, just to really keep their stuff in demand once they get to the point where they and they're going to, because that's what they do. It's like that video of
Yeah,
the guy
I
who the distillery that started and they created two labels with the same whiskey and they just kept going. Like that's what Buffalo Trace is doing.
yeah, I could see them coming out with a toasted something
Mm.
like an Taylor toasted
Oh
or
my
a
god! Can you imagine the taters?
Eagle
What they
Rare
would do?
toasted. That would be fantastic.
That would be fantastic.
But like I think Elijah Craig toasted is a great move. And that's supposedly going to be readily available relatively
That's
soon.
what they've been saying for 2 years since it came out.
I just read an article that they're going to push that into normal
Are they?
release schedule and to make way for toasted rye
Nice.
as like the next allocated bottle, which I would be all
So
over
I just
that.
saw this morning too.
I'll tate out on that all day.
I don't I don't know if this is 100% going to happen, but I saw the label got approved for toasted barrel proof Elijah Craig store picks.
Ooh, that's cool.
Yeah,
That would be cool.
that's very cool.
That's, I mean, the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof is probably one of my favorites.
Mm-hmm. Imagine that
Um,
toasted barrel proof, and it's a store pick.
Yeah, I think that's
Will
probably some of the
you
best whiskey.
stop your whiskey collection at that point? We've
I've
reached the
reached
peak. We can't get any better than this.
Yeah. No, the peak would be Elijah 18
Mm,
uncut, unfiltered.
mm. All right.
That would be it. That would be like $1,000 bottle, I'm sure, though.
But yeah, I mean, these are the things I think we're gonna start seeing, and we're gonna have to start seeing them, because if the big guys want to squash all the little guys and keep their brands interesting, they're gonna have to do things like this, to kind of spread their brand horizontally instead of vertically, because there's going to be no more room vertically to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're already seeing like you said, the decline of Amberana. I think there's probably a few more finishes that we'll probably see go the wayside relatively soon. I think Double Oak is one that really hasn't reached its full potential yet, and I'd like to see more Double Oaks. It's like Woodford Double Oak shows that you can do it unbelievably well every single time, at like a reasonable price. So, yeah, that I think is one that I'd like to see grow, but also I have a feeling that with my pessimistic outlook on the bourbon market in general, I feel like finishes are going to be on the downturn in the next few years as people, I think, get burnt out on finishes. But that also might open the window for the big six to come out with their like heavy hitter finishes and push everybody out and, solidify their market shares,
Yeah.
It's like right now the finished whiskey thing I think lends itself more to the craft size distilleries and the like smaller distilleries, because you're not talking about finishing in like such mass quantity that it's like it probably becomes difficult to source barrels for finishes at the Buffalo Trace output level. But it's only a matter of time before they sign that contract with Foursquare or whoever.
Yeah,
to
I mean,
get, rum barrels or
that's a
whatever.
good point. It's definitely gonna one of the biggest challenges is sourcing barrels for these bigger distilleries, because they need huge quantities, to do like one label of a finished product. But also, the other challenge is consistency. Like a lot of
Yeah.
these smaller brands are, like we talked about with Starlight, like they're tasting these barrels every 2-3 days when they're in the finishing barrel, because if you go one day too far, you can really tell, and it makes a big difference in the final flavor of the whiskey. So I think the biggest challenge is, yes, sourcing barrels, and also getting the right consistency and flavor profile that you really want out of that finishing barrel, which is why I think a lot of them lean towards the double oak or the toasted thing, because I think you have a little bit more wiggle room with that than you do with like a sweeter type of finish, like an Armagnac or a port or some kind of wine finish, where as soon as you just go too far, it's too late. You can't undo it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind overall the concept. Like I've said, I think it can be done extremely well. We've talked about a few that can be done that are done extremely well. Now, I kind of want to talk about the gimmicky realm
Okay. Yeah.
of finishing a little bit. I think we had talked about on our gimmicky whiskey episode, Oak and Eden, uses the spires in the bottles to essentially finish the whiskey inside the bottle. you turned me on to their Amberana whiskey, um, which is absolutely 100%. I'll absolutely love it or absolutely hate it.
Yeah, I mean
kind of
it's
whiskey.
the most
Um,
amber, like when someone, it is the most Amberana forward Amberana finish out there. There's nothing that has that much
yeah,
Amberana. So if you like Amberana, you're gonna love that bottle. And we sold out of it quick, and I still have people asking me to do another one, or if we have more. I even have one person who wants to pick their own barrel of it, just because they liked it so much. But that is like, if you love Amberana, find yourself an Oakneedon Amberana stave, because that thing is
mhm.
really good. If you don't like Amberana, stay away, stay far away, because you are
Yeah,
not gonna like it. It is in your
yeah.
face with the
I've heard it
Amberana.
called offensive and a bastardization of whiskey. So yeah, it's definitely out there in terms of flavor. However, I think in general, they do a really good job um, using those spires to finish the whiskey. Um, they have, because basically they're a finisher, right? They buy the whiskey from wherever, and they formulate these different spires to create some sort of finished whiskey in the bottle,
Yeah,
um, which is a cool and like
I was
innovative
gonna say
thing.
it's more of like a cool and innovative thing. Like, I don't think it's your bourbon snobs whiskey, but if you're
Yeah.
getting together with people who like whiskey, and you could just kind of want to present something different, I think it is cool, and I do think that their quality is there. Somehow they figured out how to make it so it doesn't over oak with that stave sitting in there. They have the
Mhm.
right percentage of oak versus whiskey, where it'll take everything it can out of that stave, so much that it will stop aging and stop finishing because it just extracted everything it could out of that little piece of oak. So I think it's cool. I think it's interesting and it's something different. And I think that's what I said and what we talked about when we're talking about gimmicky whiskey is, I think we can, maybe Dan said it was a gimmick, but we concluded that it wasn't a
Yeah.
gimmick just because it's something cool and different and innovative, and you need something kind of innovative and new to stand out right now in the whiskey world. Um, but
Mhm.
yeah, it's not your bourbon snobs whiskey. Nobody who's really into bourbon and a purist is gonna be into Oaken.
Right. Um, but I think that, and there's probably some other brands that are doing something similar in the sense of like really interesting and wild finishes. Um, I can't think of any. I know like Garrison Brothers does some pretty interesting finished products. Bal Maria is basically a double oak. Guadalupe is some sort of wine finish. Um, and like those are pretty potent because they're Texas, so they absorb quite a bit of the finishing liquid in that Texas heat. Um, so those are you know strong flavor wise.
Well, the first thing that
Yeah, I
the first
mean,
thing that pops into my head for innovative finishes, which is a very new brand, um, but Dark Arts, they're
yeah,
they're they're going to be. They haven't released it yet, but is that the Amberana Rye? Nice.
yeah,
They haven't released it yet, but I don't even remember what the type of wood was. But when we were down there a couple weeks ago, Macaulay said they're coming out with, it's the first American whiskey to be finished in this type of oak. So I think
mm,
things like that are interesting to even bourbon snobs and purists because there's it's never been done before. So just some kind of new flavor that you're gonna
yeah,
hit, and even their Jupilis French oak finish, which I learned when we were there. The Jupilis French oak is a different type of French oak that's about 50% more expensive than regular French oak, so nobody uses it. But it
Mm.
finishes the whiskey the same way French oak does without giving that like drying, tannicky flavor. Um,
Oh.
and it's pretty spot on. Like you get a lot of spice, and then you get some tannins, but they're sweet, and it's kind of like a
Mm.
double oak French oak, how you would want it to be, versus like a kind of
Yeah.
dried out like Maker's 46. Like nothing wrong with it, but that's technically a double oak, and it's pretty dry compared to like a Woodford double oak, which is extremely sweet.
Yeah. Very.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. The French oak in general is not my cup of tea
Mhm.
because it's so
But yeah,
dry.
you ought to try
Um,
the
but
the. Have you tried the Dark Arts, the Jupilis French Oak?
no, but it
The
sounds
red
like it'd
label.
be
I mean,
more
it
up my
is
alley.
you get all the flavors of French oak, but does not dry your mouth out like French oak does typically. So yeah, it's interesting. I know he's coming out with a few new things that are. He claims they're the first American whiskeys to be finished in these types of oak, and that's kind of what he's doing a lot of research on is different types of oak and whatnot. So I think that's kind of
Mhm.
cool, and especially coming this late in the game with with an MGP brand and Kentucky sourced brand. You need to really do
Mhm.
something different in order to stand out. So I mean, props to him on going all in on finding these different types of oaks and using those to his advantage.
Yeah, the other one that's interesting is the chinkapin
Yeah,
oak. That's from, is it Missouri where that's grown,
is it? I mean,
or
I don't
Mississippi?
know. Yeah, that sounds about
I
right.
can't remember. I thought it was in the South. Um, but I've tried a couple of those. I think you poured one of those at a blind tasting, and it's super interesting.
Well, no.
It's like one of those things where I'd like to have it solo and like outside of a matchup, um, and really give it like some time, because it's very, very different in like the kind of flavors that it imparts.
Well, it's the only thing.
Almost like not. Yeah,
No, I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna say the only thing I can think of with Chinkapin Oak is there was a Glenallachie that came out that was Chinkapin Oak
Yeah,
finished.
yeah.
Because I can't think of
Um,
any American whiskeys. I'm sure there are some, but I can't think of any. Um,
I thought there was one more recently that we tried. Um, Maybe not though. Yeah, that Glenallachie for sure was the one I'm thinking of, but there was another one I thought.
the first thing
Um,
that popped up when I searched Chinkapin Oak was Buffalo Trace. They've got an experimental, which I had never heard of. We've definitely never
yeah,
gotten. Yeah, it is from. Wait. Yeah, I think it is from Missouri. From like the Ozark area.
yeah.
Um,
Well, before we wrap up, um, we should talk about this Bacta
we
bourbon.
should, and
That
I have a story too about why finished whiskey can sometimes be a bad thing.
yeah.
All
Go ahead and tell your story then,
right, all
and then
right.
we'll end on a good note.
I really, I don't. All right, I don't know if I thought about telling the story or not telling the story because I really don't like, talking down on brands or talking negative about brands unless they're like, B word only brands. Um, but so we were doing picks from Untitled out in DC,
Uh-huh.
and they had some of the best MGP unfinished whiskey that I've ever tasted. This was kind of like right before. MGP really took off and everybody wanted Indiana bourbon. We got 4 barrel pick samples from Untitled, and they were all 14-year MGP bourbons. They're actually 13 to 14-year MGP bourbons.
Oh,
And so we
wow.
sat down,
That's not
not
common.
common at all. And I mean, again, this was 5. This was probably 4 or 5 years ago. This was before MGP like really took off. But so we had 4 samples. They were 13 and 14-year MGP, and they were unbelievable, like just ridiculous. There were 3 barrels out of the 4 that we were like, this is the next best thing. We could pick all 4 of these, but like 3 of these are like ridiculously good. So we asked them, can we pick 3 barrels? And they're like, yeah, sure, why not? Again, this is before MGP really took off, because if that would have happened now, it would be like, no, you're lucky to pick one of these.
No.
But they're like, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
take them. So we picked 3 barrels. As soon as people got to taste them, like they sold out pretty quick. This was the Joker series, by the way, that the Adventures Club did about 4 or 5 years ago. So then we hit them up again and we said, hey, can we get more samples? You guys have more barrels? And they said, yeah, we've got about 15 barrels, 20 barrels. We'll send you guys 4 more samples. So we were so excited. We planned this night to get together and taste these 4 new samples. We're like, this is amazing. We're going to get probably 3 more barrels out of this, and they're going to sell extremely fast, and people are going to love them. And we're sitting there in probably silence for about 5, maybe 10 minutes, tasting these 4 samples, and somebody blurts out, these are all shit. What are we doing here? These are terrible. And we all look up and we're like, finally somebody said it. But yeah, like these are not good barrels. They tasted like burnt tire, like rubber oak. Like they
Oh.
just sat in the barrel for way too long. And again, these are unfinished 13, 14-year MGP barrels. And we were like, yeah, wow, like none of us liked any of these barrels. So we went from picking 3 out of 4 of the samples sent to saying, sorry, 0 for 4. We didn't like any of these. If you have more barrels, we'll taste them. But, inside we're a little skeptical now. So long story
Yeah.
short, they sent us 4 to 6 more samples. We ended up picking like 2 more barrels out of those. There were 2 more really good ones. And I think we tasted all the old MGP that they had. And then you started to see them come out with all these different finished 14-year MGP bourbons. And they were heavily finished. They were like wine
Mhm.
finished, Cabernet finished, port finished, cognac finished, Armagnac finished. Like there was 4 or 5 finishes.
Super strong
Yeah, there was like 4 or 5
base
finishes
liquids.
on each one, and they were dark as hell. They were like poured out like black. And it was one of those, like, if you like finished whiskeys, you might really like this, but if not, stay away because they're heavily finished whiskeys. And so
Mhm.
that's kind of when I learned, like, all right, finishing sometimes might be to cover something up. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because every barrel needs to find a home. No distillery is just going to dump a barrel down the drain and let it go to waste. They're going
Right.
to need to find a home with it. So props to them for saying, all right, let's do something here with these and put it in these different barrels and make it taste pretty good. But yeah, I mean, I don't, yeah, so that's like a bad example on, and maybe a cautionary warning on, certain finishing bottles. Like when you see a true one off of a brand, like maybe beware. But yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Mhm.
some people really like those finished barrels that came from Untitled, but others not so much.
Yeah. I mean, it's like for me, it comes down to did they do a good job or not? Um, I think most of the time finishing is done fairly well. Um, however, I think sometimes there's a little bit of a rush to the market and things are over finished or under finished or just crappy whiskeys thrown in some kind of barrel and you get what you get kind of thing. And it's just like you said, you gotta be aware that not everything's gonna be a home run. Like we covered a lot of the brands that are safe safe bets for finishes. So there's plenty of options out there. There's plenty of safe options out there. So yeah.
Yeah, there are plenty of safe options, and there's a lot of fun to be had. And speaking of safe options, I'm diving into this Bacta 2014 Armagnac finished bourbon, and it's pretty spectacular. It's one of those job well dones. It's extremely balanced, which is probably the biggest thing that I look for. And you if you know me, you hear me use the term balanced a lot because that's one of the biggest things I look for in any whiskey, but especially a finished whiskey. It needs to have balance.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to taste the Armagnac. You don't want to taste the port. You don't want to taste the cognac. You don't want to taste the sherry. You want to taste the bourbon, and you want to have it influenced by the finishing barrel, and you want it to be a good balance between the two. You don't want one of the two to overpower the other, but if you can get them to mingle and work together nicely, then I think it's a job well done and it's something worth sipping on.
Yeah, I would agree. This is the this year's Bacta bourbon release. This is 2014 distilled bourbon. So about 10 years old.
They officially called it a 9 year.
9 year, okay. Yeah, finished in Armagnac. I am a fan of the Armagnac bourbon finish, and I think the tannic quality of the Armagnac really pulls back on the sweetness of combining the Armagnac and the bourbon in a very nice way. And it makes, like you said, a very balanced pour. You get some of those like dried fruit kind of notes where, like, I mean, a 10-year bourbon's nothing to, sneeze at. But like this really tastes more like a 15-year-old bourbon because of that Armagnac finish, or maybe even older. It just adds a lot of really nice dark depth to the bourbon without, again, overpowering it. You still get some of the nice, like, typical bourbon notes, and you can definitely taste that it's bourbon. It's definitely corn based. So,
And it's
really well done.
Creamy. It's got a very nice body to it. They also finished this in their 1973 Armagnac cask, which was named, I forgot the competition, but it was named the best spirit in the world in this competition. So they're not just using any Armagnac cask, they're using some very special Armagnac casks. And compared to the 2013 bourbon, which I think we all thought was pretty good, I think this blows it away. I think this is, I mean, we're a little early here, but this could be on my whiskeys of the year list.
There we go. Making calls in April. I like it.
But I'm also a big Armagnac fan in general, and this is another whiskey where I think if you don't like Armagnac, you might not like this as much as I do, because the Armagnac does shine through a lot, and you do pick up a lot of those like figgy date type of notes. and it kind of tames down the spice that you normally find in MGP. Although this is 99% corn, so it's a little bit different than your typical MGP bourbon. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of good things to say about this. I have almost nothing negative to say about this. But yeah, it's just a really nice all around bourbon to sip on.
Yeah, agreed. It very well done. Good job, Raj.
Good job, Rush. Oh my god, this is so good.
Yeah, it is.
The more I sip
already
it,
moved on to the. I'm drinking the dark
oh
arts
yeah,
now, and it's also.
I've been waiting till the end of the episode to sip on this Bacta. It's really good. It is, man. I think it's it's for sure in my top 2 so far this year. We'll see if it can last till the end of the year to be in my top 5.
All right. Where would people be able to buy this?
I think that's a good hint for a coupon code. We've got it at Gold Eagle. It's $150. It's not your cheap bourbon that you're gonna grab, but I think it's extremely complex, and it's a perfect example of a finished, well done. So yeah, go to goldeaglewine.com, use the coupon code. Let's do BM 2014. BM 2014. It's good online only at goldeaglewine.com or on our app, and it'll get you 10% off the Bacta 2014 bourbon. But yeah, you can also follow us on Instagram at Gold Eagle Wine, Facebook at Gold Eagle Spirits. Keep up to date with all of our daily drops and events, tastings, and what's going on at the store. So yeah.
All right. And you can follow the podcast at Bourbon Matters on Instagram and Facebook. Watch us on YouTube and Spotify, and listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you like, subscribe, follow, rate, leave comments. We do like getting comments, even though we've shit talked almost everybody that's left comments. We do like it, I swear. Also, check out my other podcast, Movie Matters, at Movie Matters on Instagram, and also on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the other platforms. Me and my buddy Kevin watch movies from the 80s and talk about them and kind of rate them, but we're not too picky because we're movie lovers. So that's a fun show to watch too. All right. So cheers to finished whiskey.
Cheers to finished whiskey. There's some good stuff out there. If it's done right. Yeah, if it's done right. Mm-hmm. But also caution.
Yeah. Make sure give things a taste if you can before buying.
Or make sure you trust the brand. But yeah, there's a lot of fun out there.
Yeah, trust the brand.
There's a lot to keep us on our toes. There's a lot of good stuff out there. So don't just because it's finished doesn't mean you should always stay away.
Yep. All right. We'll see you next week.
All right.
Cheers. Dan has the good glass.